Let's consider the history of world wars. Facts such as violence, famine, and desperation end up on both sides from the inside out. At present, the most fierce and critical war of the century has led to a socio-political, military, geostrategic crisis in Eastern Europe, and the world order is slowly heading towards a major disruption. So how do you think this situation can be fixed? How can the old order of the world be restored? How will this war end? Let's analyze these questions right away. For this, let's first look at the efforts of the Ukrainian armed forces in recent days and what counter-strategy the Russians have developed against these efforts. The war in Ukraine, as we all know, has taken over the Donbas region. In particular, ground offensive operations captured both Donetsk and Luhansk. What about Ukraine's southern front lines? Let's also remember the views of the Ukrainian leader Zelensky on this issue. The war started in Crimea and will end there. We've all heard this phrase over and over. But did you know that Ukraine is effectively advancing along the southern front lines for its current major Crimean offensive plan? In Melitopol, one of the most important cities of this plan, the Ukrainians took a striking step recently. This news, which fell like a bomb on the agenda, has already worried the Russians about the Crimea, which is planned to be taken back by the Ukrainians. In the past day, the armed forces of Ukraine destroyed 2 Russian main military bases in Melitopol. The fact that the 2 violent explosions in the city could be so effective were the estimations of opening a corridor to the Crimea, as we mentioned. Melitopol Mayor Ivan Fedorov shared the first warm statement about the situation after 2 violent explosions in the city. According to Fedorov, the explosions in Melitopol resulted in the death of hundreds of Russian soldiers. The situation in the city is still said to be critical, and the fires caused by the explosions reportedly damaged these 2 Russian military bases as well. Melitopol stands at a very strategic point on the way to liberate Crimea. The Russian main headquarters blown up by the Ukrainian armed forces were located on a very important transfer route between Mariupol and Crimea. In this context, this operation was strategically a very important move to cut the connection between the Crimea and the Russian army in Ukraine. With this critical attack in Melitopol, did the Ukrainian armed forces continue to pursue their plans to retake Crimea since the beginning of the war? Yes, maybe it's too early to tell, but if you are aware, it is important that the recent drone attacks on Crimea, the targeting of a city like Armyansk, which can connect with Crimea in terms of land border by Ukraine. These attacks constantly bring before us a reality that we cannot realize at the moment. Ukraine very much wants to take back Crimea and is trying to complete the Melitopol phase for this to happen. Also, for a long time, the attacks by the Ukrainian forces had not caused such a loss to the Russians. The fact that hundreds of Russian soldiers were neutralized in Melitopol with a single attack of the Ukrainian forces is actually a very serious situation, but the exact figures would be stated completely and accurately in the coming days. At the moment, it's said that the casualties are very high. Of course, after these striking attacks, discussions also flared up about Melitopol's connection with the Crimean plan, and whether the Ukrainian forces would continue their attacks on the recapture of the peninsula. According to the city's exiled mayor, what is happening in the southern city of Melitopol is touted as the gateway to the Crimean Peninsula. On the other hand, it is not only the soldiers of the Ukrainian army who are making efforts to liberate the peninsula again. We must also recognize what the Ukrainian partisans are doing in this regard. Ukrainian partisans who work day and night for the freedom of their country and to get out of this war with the least damage took very serious steps, especially in Melitopol, the front line that divides the Zaporizhia region in 2. In recent days, it is said that Ukrainian partisan groups have provided intelligence data to the Ukrainian armed forces, as well as some operational breakthroughs. And even Russian troops cannot move very easily, not only in Melitopol but also in the south of Ukraine. Because Ukrainian partisans share the strategic positions of the Russian troops on the southern front lines, including Melitopol, the locations of ammunition depots, and the route followed by the Russian army in the south of Ukraine with the Ukrainian armed forces. In this way, the Ukrainian forces can destroy the important military resources of the Russians with pinpoint operations. But given the advances in Melitopol and clashes in southern Ukraine, Is there sufficient ground for the Ukrainian forces to retake Crimea now? The dominance of the Ukrainians in Kherson and the violent clashes in the Dnipro archipelago even now, in a way, set the cornerstones of this backdrop for the Ukrainian armed forces. Because the Ukrainian army continues to attack from almost every direction to take back the Crimean Peninsula. Let's take a quick look at the latest situation in the Dnipro Islands region. Currently, Ukrainian forces are making serious efforts to move on to the next phase of their major Crimean offensive plan. You may remember that the Ukrainian army established a river navy that would be active in the southern directions of Dnipro. This navy needed a flagship. This need was met by the Ukrainians with a war beast called Bucha. Currently, the boat is allegedly in the cool waters of Dnipro towards Kiev. This is even proven by some photographs. After photos of Bucha in the Dnipro River were shared, the Russians once again realized how serious the Ukrainian forces' plans to operate in the south were. So, were these striking plans of the Ukrainians limited to Bucha? Of course not. The fire that started in Dnipro finally reached the Crimea. If you remember recently, Ukrainian forces targeted the Crimean city of Bakhchisarai. The cities of Yalta and Gurzów were also affected by the striking Ukrainian airstrikes. After the attacks, the sirens of the air defense systems were heard again in the Crimean Peninsula. It was precisely at this point that the Ukrainian forces succeeded in preparing a very effective ground for recapturing the Crimea. Currently, the Crimean Peninsula, which was constantly targeted by Ukrainian drones, was currently in the attack range of the Ukrainians. Because the Ukrainian army could target this peninsula both with its drones and with its long-range missiles. Especially in this critical time period, the fact that the Ukrainians were so close to the goal of Crimea increased the probability of the peninsula to return to its original owner. You know that before the recent attacks that affected the cities of Bakhchisarai, Yalta, and Gurzów, the Ukrainian forces were constantly conducting drone strikes on the peninsula to detect the strategic positions of the Russian air defense systems on the Crimean Peninsula. The use of cost-effective drones for this purpose and the fact that there was not much expectation from the attacks highlighted the ingenious war strategy of the Ukrainians. And the most important detail on this issue was that the Ukrainians had achieved their goal. Because the Ukrainian armed forces used cheap unmanned aerial vehicles, such as the Mugen 5, to explore the locations of the Russian air defense systems in Crimea in the past weeks. These drone attacks carried out in the early hours of the morning once again brought the tension in Crimea to its peak. These attacks took place around 6 a.m. Ukrainian forces firstly sent 5 Mugen UAVs to Crimea. All of these UAVs were destroyed by Russian air defense systems on the peninsula. About 1 hour after this attack, 5 Mugen-type UAVs appeared again in the skies of Crimea. According to some sources, some of these 5 UAVs damaged Russian military resources in the peninsula. However, according to the Russian media, the attack carried out by the Ukrainian forces with a total of 10 Mugen 5 UAVs was not successful, but the Russians were missing a very important detail. As you can see, the Ukrainian armed forces can carry out airstrikes on the Crimean Peninsula at any time, and some of these attacks can create serious risk factors for the Russian troops on the peninsula. In addition, the residents of the Crimea region and the families, relatives of the Russian soldiers on the peninsula are also disturbed by this situation. This is why every day there is an influx of people from the peninsula. The peninsula piers are home to thousands of Russians who, especially in the last days, want to escape from Crimea and do not want to experience the effects of the war anymore. Unlike people who do not want to live in Crimea because of Russia's war strategies, Ukraine prioritizes the idea of "I want to live." Thank you for watching us.